Lucifer was created as a radiant, wise, and powerful heavenly being, formed not to rival God, but to reflect His glory. Long before darkness was ever associated with His name, He stood in brilliance, a servant designed to carry light, order, and beauty through the courts of heaven. His presence was not feared, it was admired. His purpose was not rebellion, it was worship. Imagine a realm where light was not cast by the sun, but by obedience, where harmony flowed not from instruments, but from devotion. In that place, Lucifer moved with grace and authority, entrusted with a role unlike any other to direct praise toward the Creator, not toward himself. Every gift he carried was given, every honor he held was borrowed, and every moment of splendor was meant to point upward, not inward. But here is the question that changes everything. How does a being surrounded by perfection begin to drift? How does reflection slowly turn into self-admiration? And how does admiration, if left unchecked, become the seed of a fall that echoes across eternity? This is not just the story of an angel. It is the story of how pride is born, how deception takes root, and how even the greatest gifts can become dangerous when their source is forgotten. The fall of Lucifer did not begin with chaos or violence, it began quietly, with a shift of focus, a subtle turn of the heart. Stay with us, because this story reveals more than ancient history. It exposes a pattern that still shapes our world today. If you are ready to see this story in a new light, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us as we uncover the hidden origins of one of the most misunderstood figures in all of history. This is the beginning of a journey that challenges what we think we know, so do not look away. The shift did not happen in a moment of open rebellion, nor did it arrive with thunder or chaos. It began quietly, almost invisibly, deep within the heart of the one who had been created to reflect light rather than claim it, surrounded by beauty, entrusted with honor, and moving daily within the presence of divine glory. Lucifer found himself standing at a dangerous crossroads that few could even perceive. The brilliance that once humbled him slowly became familiar, and what is familiar can lose its power to inspire reverence. Where there had once been awe, there was now comfort. Where there had once been gratitude, there was now self-awareness. Isaiah's ancient words pull back the veil on this internal turning point, revealing not an external enemy, but a private dialogue unfolding within Lucifer's own thoughts. "I will ascend," he said within himself, not as a shout, but as a conviction taking shape. It was not an outright denial of God's greatness, but something far more subtle and far more dangerous. The belief that the glory flowing through him could belong to him. The line between reflection and possession began to blur, and in that blur, pride found room to grow. Lucifer did not seek to destroy what God had made. He sought to elevate himself within it, believing that his position, beauty, and authority entitled him to more than he had been given. This inward shift explains why the fall was inevitable long before it was visible. Pride does not announce itself loudly at first. It whispers. It reassures. It reframes gratitude into entitlement and transforms service into self-importance. Each "I will" spoken in the heart became a step upward in Lucifer's own imagination, even as it marked a descent away from the very purpose for which he was created. The tragedy was not that he lacked something, but that he forgot where everything he had came from. The light he carried had never originated in him. Yet he began to see himself not as a vessel, but as a source. As this mindset took hold, obedience quietly weakened. Reverence gave way to comparison, and comparison gave way to ambition. Standing so close to the throne, Lucifer began to measure himself not against other created beings, but against the Creator himself. This was the breaking point. To desire closeness to God is not corruption, but to desire God's position is a rejection of order itself. The declarations in Isaiah are not the language of a warrior preparing for battle, but of a being reshaping reality within his own mind, convincing himself that ascent was deserved rather than granted. What makes this moment so unsettling is how familiar it feels. Pride rarely begins with rebellion. It begins with forgetting dependence, forgetting boundaries, forgetting that gifts are given, not earned. Lucifer's fall was not caused by darkness entering him, but by light being redirected inward. The glory that once flowed through him toward its source now curved back upon itself, creating a closed circle where humility could no longer exist. In that inward turn, the role of servant collapsed, and the desire to rule took its place. By the time rebellion became visible, the decision had already been made in silence. Heaven did not witness the beginning of Lucifer's fall, because it happened where no other being could see. It happened in thought, in desire, in the private elevation of self. The story moves forward from here, but the pattern is already complete. Pride had taken root, and once pride is fully formed, the fall is no longer a possibility. It is only a matter of time. What began as a quiet shift of the heart did not remain hidden forever. Pride, once fully formed, always seeks expression, and in time Lucifer's inward ambition moved outward, touching those who stood closest to him. His authority had never been solitary. He had been placed over others, entrusted with influence, leadership, and responsibility. And it was within this sphere of trust that the consequences of his private rebellion first became visible. Those under his charge had followed him for ages, not out of fear, but out of admiration. They had known him as a guide, a source of order and beauty, a figure whose presence seemed inseparable from the light of heaven itself. As his vision of himself changed, so too did the way he spoke, the way he led, and the way he framed reality. Rebellion did not spread through force or confrontation, but through persuasion shaped by confidence and familiarity. Lucifer did not need to deny the existence of God to sow division. He only needed to redirect attention, to suggest that the glory flowing through heaven was something to be shared more equally, something that belonged not solely to the throne, but also to those who had faithfully served near it. For angels who had never stood directly before the fullness of divine presence, Lucifer himself became the reference point. His brilliance, once clearly understood as reflected light, now appeared increasingly like a source in its own right. This is how influence turns dangerous. Trust creates openness, and openness allows ideas to take root long before their consequences are understood. The rebellion described in Revelation did not erupt suddenly. It crystallized after countless moments of agreement, small affirmations, and unchallenged assumptions. Loyalty began to shift, not away from heaven, but toward a vision of heaven reshaped around Lucifer's elevated self-image. In that distortion, obedience was redefined, and alignment with the created order quietly fractured. When the breaking point finally came, heaven itself felt the strain of that division. Revelation 12 describes a conflict unlike anything creation had known before, a clash not between strangers, but between beings who had once shared purpose and harmony. This was not chaos breaking in from the outside, but rupture forming from within. Authority met resistance, truth confronted distortion, and allegiance was tested at the highest level. The conflict revealed what had already been decided in the heart long before it reached the visible realm. Lucifer's expulsion was not an overreaction, nor was it arbitrary. It was the inevitable outcome of a reality that could no longer hold together. A kingdom built on order cannot sustain a leader who seeks to redefine that order around himself. Once pride became action, separation was unavoidable. The one who had once moved freely within the courts of heaven found himself cast out, not because he was misunderstood, but because his presence had become incompatible with the very light he once reflected. The fall was swift when it came, but it was not sudden. Revelation captures the moment of removal, not the long process that made it necessary. With his expulsion, Lucifer's influence did not vanish, but it was fundamentally altered. Authority became opposition, leadership became resistance, and purpose turned inward and destructive. The harmony he once helped sustain now stood in contrast to his new identity, defined not by creation or reflection, but by accusation and division. This moment marks the transition from internal corruption to cosmic consequence. What had begun as self-exaltation now reshaped the structure of allegiance itself, leaving a lasting scar on the narrative of creation. Heaven moved forward, restored in order but marked by memory, while the one who had sought ascent began a descent that would echo far beyond that first expulsion. The conflict described in Revelation is not merely a record of war, but a revelation of how pride, once allowed to lead, inevitably fractures even the most glorious of beginnings. The moment Lucifer was cast out of heaven, something far more profound than a change of location took place. His fall marked the collapse of an identity that had once defined his very existence. The name Lucifer, meaning light-bearer, was inseparable from purpose, calling, and function. It described what he did and how he existed within the created order. Once removed from the presence of the light he had reflected, that name no longer fit. What remained was not a bearer of illumination, but a being defined by opposition. In that transformation, a new name emerged: Satan, the adversary, the accuser, revealing not a new power, but a new posture toward reality itself. Stripped of his former role, Satan did not gain creative authority. Creation belongs solely to God, and nothing in the fall transferred that capacity to him. Instead, his influence became parasitic, dependent on distortion rather than design. Where Lucifer once reflected truth, Satan now bends it. Where he once directed attention upward, he now redirects it inward or outward in confusion. His strength no longer lies in what he can produce, but in how convincingly he can imitate, reshape, and misrepresent what already exists. This shift explains the nature of his presence in the world that follows. He does not arrive as a destroyer of reality, but as a manipulator of perception. This change is evident in the way he operates after the fall. He does not announce himself openly, nor does he operate through obvious opposition. Instead, he works through suggestion, ambiguity, and partial truth. Having lost access to the fullness of divine light, he relies on fragments, pieces of truth removed from their context and presented as substitutes for the whole. In this way, deception becomes his primary tool, not because it is more powerful than truth, but because it is easier to accept when it appears familiar. The one who once led worship now studies trust, not to preserve it, but to exploit it. The role of accuser reflects this new orientation. Satan's focus shifts toward exposing, exaggerating, and condemning, not for the sake of justice, but to fracture relationships and erode confidence. Accusation creates distance, and distance weakens connection. By emphasizing failure over purpose and fear over alignment, he works to obscure the original design of creation. His accusations are not aimed at restoring order, but at reinforcing separation, both between humanity and God and within the human heart itself. This is not the work of a rival creator, but of a being unable to generate meaning on his own. What makes this transformation especially tragic is that Satan's methods are shaped by memory. He remembers what light looks like, how truth sounds, and how authority once functioned. And he uses that knowledge to mimic what he can no longer embody. This is why deception often appears refined rather than crude, persuasive rather than forceful. His influence thrives where discernment weakens, where familiarity replaces vigilance, and where reflection is mistaken for origin. The loss of identity did not erase his awareness. It sharpened his resentment. Yet even in this altered state, his limitations are clear. Deception requires participation. Distortion needs a listener. Unlike creation, which exists by divine will alone, deception collapses when exposed to clarity and truth. Satan's power is therefore reactive, not foundational. It depends entirely on misdirection and misunderstanding, not on inherent authority. This reality places boundaries around his influence, even as his presence continues to echo through history. The shift from Lucifer to Satan is not merely a change of name, but a revelation of consequence. Identity detached from purpose becomes opposition by default. The light-bearer who turned inward now survives only in shadow, not because light was taken from him by force, but because he stepped away from its source. His story moves forward from here, not as a creator of darkness, but as a disturber of truth, operating within the limits imposed by the very order he once served. Having lost his place and purpose, Satan's influence did not disappear with his fall. It adapted. No longer able to operate through authority or creation, he refined a different kind of strategy, one rooted in disruption rather than domination. His approach would remain remarkably consistent across time, cultures, and contexts, revealing a pattern that becomes clearer the more closely it is examined. Rather than striking openly, he targets the inner structure of faith itself, focusing on trust, identity, and obedience. These are not random targets, but the very foundations that keep a created being aligned with its creator. The first recorded example of this strategy unfolds in the quiet beauty of Eden. The garden was not a place of fear or struggle, but of clarity and abundance. Humanity's connection with God was unbroken, their sense of self secure, their obedience natural rather than forced. Satan's presence there did not come with threats or displays of power. It came in the form of a question, carefully framed to sound reasonable rather than hostile. By asking whether God had truly spoken as humanity believed, he introduced uncertainty where none had existed before. The question was not designed to deny God outright, but to reposition his word as something negotiable. Trust, once cracked, allowed curiosity to take its place, and curiosity opened the door to disobedience that felt justified rather than defiant. This same pattern appears again in the account of Job, though the setting is very different. Here, Satan does not approach a human directly, but challenges the nature of faith itself. He reframes obedience as transaction, suggesting that devotion exists only because it is rewarded. In doing, he attacks identity at a deeper level, implying that faith rooted in trust cannot survive suffering. The events that follow are not meant to destroy belief through force, but to test whether trust can endure when understanding is stripped away. Job's story reveals the limits of Satan's approach, showing that while circumstances can be shaken, identity grounded in truth can remain intact. The strategy reaches its most revealing moment in the wilderness, where Satan confronts Jesus after a prolonged period of hunger and isolation. Once again, there is no attempt at overwhelming power. Instead, Satan speaks in language that sounds familiar, even authoritative, quoting scripture while subtly altering its intent. Each temptation begins with a challenge to identity, questioning whether Jesus truly is who he claims to be. The offer is not framed as rebellion, but as efficiency, self-preservation, and rightful authority. Yet each suggestion carries the same underlying demand: act independently of trust and redefine obedience on your own terms. What connects these moments is not the setting, but the method. Satan does not invent lies from nothing. He reshapes truth until it bends just enough to lead away from its source. By isolating pieces of truth from the larger framework of trust, he creates alternatives that feel reasonable and even justified. This approach avoids confrontation because confrontation invites clarity. Deception thrives in ambiguity, in halves, and in subtle shifts of perspective that are difficult to detect in the moment. This pattern explains why his influence persists across generations. Trust, identity, and obedience are internal realities, shaped by belief rather than force. When these are destabilized, behavior follows naturally. Satan's role is not to compel action, but to make disobedience feel like insight and self-direction feel like freedom. The consistency of this approach reveals its effectiveness, but also its dependence on human participation. In each account, the outcome ultimately hinges on response. Where trust is maintained and identity remains anchored, deception loses its power. Satan's strategy has not changed because it does not need to. Its success depends on the same vulnerability that first appeared in Eden: the willingness to question the source of truth while relying on one's own interpretation to replace it. This recurring pattern moves the story forward, not as a series of isolated encounters, but as a single, unfolding narrative that continues to echo wherever trust, identity, and obedience are tested. As the story reaches its final horizon, one truth stands unshaken: Satan's defeat is not a possibility waiting to be decided, but a certainty already written into the fabric of the story itself. From the beginning, his path has moved in one direction only: downward, not because of strength opposing him, but because pride cannot sustain itself forever. Pride isolates, distorts, and ultimately collapses under the weight of its own false authority. What began with self-exaltation ends in separation, and what was once radiant becomes empty when cut off from its source. The certainty of this ending is not a cause for fear, but for clarity. Satan's story stands as a warning preserved through time, showing that destruction does not begin with obvious evil, but with subtle misalignment. The desire to rise above order, to define truth independently, and to elevate self over purpose always carries the same consequence. In contrast, humility is not portrayed as weakness, but as alignment with reality. Submission is not loss of freedom, but protection from deception. Discernment is not suspicion, but wisdom sharpened by truth. This is why the story matters beyond ancient texts and cosmic imagery. It speaks to angels and humans alike because the underlying pattern is universal. Pride promises elevation but delivers isolation. Humility preserves connection. Where pride insists on being seen, humility remains grounded. Where pride demands control, humility trusts order. The fall of Satan reveals that no amount of brilliance, influence, or proximity to truth can replace the necessity of remaining oriented toward its source. The certainty of Satan's defeat also reframes his influence in the present. His power is not equal to truth, nor is it limitless. It depends on distortion, participation, and distraction. Where clarity is pursued, his influence weakens. Where humility governs ambition, deception loses its grip. The story does not end in chaos, but in resolution, reminding us that rebellion has an expiration, while truth endures. As listeners and readers, we are not meant to walk away impressed by the scale of the conflict, but instructed by its outcome. The lesson is simple, yet demanding. Remain grounded. Remain discerning. And remember that alignment matters more than elevation. The fall did not happen because light was too strong, but because it was redirected inward. The preservation of purpose, then, lies in keeping that light pointed back toward its source. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If this journey added clarity, depth, or perspective to your understanding, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue exploring stories that challenge assumptions, illuminate truth, and encourage discernment. We are grateful for your time, your attention, and your curiosity. Until next time, stay grounded, stay thoughtful, and keep seeking truth.